Good evening, everybody. My name's Ben Martin. I'm one of the vicars here at Bishop Hannington, and we're really delighted to welcome you here to this evening, an evening with Jonathan Aitken. Just to a few little housekeeping bits. If you need a toilet, they're just through the doors here to your left. Just go around the corner there and you'll see the toilets in the corner. In the event of a fire, obviously, head toward the exits at the rear of the building as well. Just to let you know what's going to happen, Jonathan's going to speak for about 45 minutes. Then there'll be a time for questions, so get those thinking now. And then we'll be finished no later than 8:45, and there'll also be refreshments available afterwards next door in the centre. You can grab a tea and a coffee and feel free to hang around and keep on talking. But you haven't come here to hear me, you've come here to hear Jonathan. Let's give a big round of applause for Jonathan Aitken. I asked Jonathan how to introduce himself. Was it an ex-MP, ex-minister, ex-convict? But also just simply Jonathan Aitken. So I'll hand over to Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to Bishop Hannington. Thank you for turning up in such amazingly big numbers. I never used to get a crowd like this when I was a politician. All I'm going to do tonight is to try to tell you a story. I hope parts of it will make you laugh occasionally. I hope parts of it will make you think occasionally. And I hope you'll find the whole story as a whole interesting. I always need to give a health warning about this story before I begin, which is simply this. Please bear in mind that I am not the hero of the story. I am the narrator of the story. A lot of things happened around me, but I'm absolutely not the hero. And the hero will emerge at a later stage of it. Like all good storytellers, I try and find a dramatic beginning. And that's quite easy, because I can time and date this dramatic beginning with some precision. Tuesday, the 8th of June, 1999, 4:25 p.m., and I was standing in an extremely uncomfortable place, the dock of the Old Bailey. And I'd been ushered into that dock by a court usher who'd clearly been racking his brains to think of something pleasant to say to me on what was for me, as the defendant, an extremely difficult occasion. And to do this, he had transformed himself into a sort of touchy-feely tourist guide. And with that brightness the tourist guides usually have, he said, "Morning, Mr. Aitken. Welcome to the Old Bailey. Do you realize you're in court number 1? It's the most famous court in the world, and that dock there is the most famous dock in the world, where we had the Cray brothers, we had Lord Haw-Haw, the Yorkshire Ripper, and now you." I wasn't in that famous dock for very long because I had pleaded guilty to charges of perjury. And all the judge really had to do was to sentence me, which he did in the time-honoured language that judges use on these occasions. The sentence of the court will be, "You will serve 18 months imprisonment. Take him down." And then off I headed down to the subterranean depths of the Old Bailey, just had time to blow a kiss to my 88-year-old mother and 4 teenage children who were sitting in the well of the court close to me. And it was another world once I got into the depths. I was quite quickly put into handcuffs, put on a chain, and led out to a vehicle known to prisoners as a sweatbox, which are those white prison vans you see driving around our big cities from time to time. And I was driven off, along with about 20 other customers that day, to Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh in South London. Belmarsh, in the jargon of prisoners, is known as a tough nick. It is, in fact, Britain's highest security prison. And I often wonder why I was sent there. The joke was that I was sent there to keep the journalists out rather than keep me in. but anyway, I got there, and the first thing that happened after we'd rolled through the great towers and security gates and so on was that we all went in past a line of very stern-looking prison officers with Alsatians on leads barking at us, went into an area called the cage, which is in fact the reception cell of the prison. And I won't forget that cage as long as I live, because the business is very brisk in it. All that day, sentenced prisoners have been pouring in from courts all over southeast England, and with the habitual optimism of criminals, they probably began the day thinking that the jury would believe everything they said and let them off, or if that went wrong, the judge would be rather lenient. But by the time they get in the cage, gloom has usually descended in a big way, and they're suddenly doing a 7 or whatever it is, and they're in a pretty miserable state. I always remember one gang who were fighting furiously among each other, punching each other, saying, "You got the script wrong, you got the script wrong, that's why we're all in here." I remember another young man who was so desperate and so despairing that he would just put his head down and charge time and time again into the bars of the cage until his head started to bleed and medical attention had to be sent for. It was that kind of a grim atmosphere. And I wasn't feeling too good myself, but at least I thought, well, I pleaded guilty, it was a fair sentence, I was expecting it, no optimism on my case. And then something very surprising happened. An officer came up to me and said, "Aitken, your turn to see the prison psychiatrist." And I knew I was having a down day, but I didn't think I needed the services of psychiatrists, so I was slightly baffled by this. In fact, as I later know, every prisoner sees a psychiatrist as they come in, just to check out whether or not there are suicide risks. But I didn't know that. To get the humour of what happened next, you have to remember, this is like 22 years ago, that at this particular moment, I was probably the most notorious person in Britain. I had been in the headlines for days. In those days, it was sensational news for a cabinet minister to be heading towards jail. It hadn't happened since the time of the Tudors. Things have changed a bit since. But at the time, it was sort of front-page news stuff. Anyway, but this news had completely passed the psychiatrist by. He'd been having a busy day, he hadn't been tuning in the news bulletins, so he asked me a lot of bog-standard questions from a form: name, date of birth, prison number, next of kin, does your next of kin know you're in prison? And the question after that was, does anyone else know you're in prison? And I thought maybe a nice smile would do at this moment, so I said, well, yes. Thinking of all those headlines, and the camera crews have been outside the Old Bailey and outside the prison all day. I said, I think maybe 7 or 8 million people know I'm in prison by now. And the psychiatrist scribbled busily on his pad. And then he said rather sharply, he said, "Do you mean to tell me you really believe that 7 or 8 million people know you're in prison, do you?" And I nodded. And then he said, in a rather sweet, kind, clinical voice, he said, "May I ask you, have you in your life ever suffered from delusions?" Well, my delusions were getting shed pretty fast that day. You get through the sort of rather grisly introductory rituals of prison, which go under the name of induction, a word which survives only in 2 places in institutional Britain: Her Majesty's prisons and the Church of England. Vicars and prisoners are inducted into their respective institutions, but the rituals are rather different, of course. And prisoners strip searching, mug-shotting, fingerprinting, getting fitted out with a whole lot of ill-fitting clothes, and enormous amount of noise and shouting going on all around you. And you get asked some rather strange questions. Somebody asked, "Could you lend me £1 million?" Somebody asked me. So I had that. Or then somebody asked me, an officer asked me a question, I had no idea what it meant. And the prisoner rushed up and said, "Don't answer." I said, "If you do, take the cucumbers. If it's the last thing you do, take the cucumbers." I had no idea what he meant at all. What he meant was, I was getting my first introduction to prison rhyming slang, which the big London prisons is the sort of lingua franca. Cucumbers equals numbers, numbers equals Rule 43. Rule 43 is a rule which says any prisoner can apply to be taken into solitary confinement on a vulnerable prisoner's wing for his own protection. And that's what sex offenders usually do, jail police officers usually do. And clearly my informant thought that probably any passing cabinet minister would be wise to do the same thing. Because I had no idea what the stuff reference to cucumbers meant, I rather luckily did not listen to him and went straight on to an ordinary wing. This time it was getting quite late in the evening, and I was very grateful to be given a single cell in Belmarsh, and when I got into that cell, I almost gave a sigh of relief. So, well, it's been a tough day, probably the worst day of my life, but at least I'll now be able to sort of sit down and have a good night's sleep. No such luck, because the prisoners of Belmarsh, unlike the psychiatrists of Belmarsh, had been well informed about my arrival, as had most of the other people in Britain by this time. And so when somebody heard an officer saying something like, "In you go, Aitken," the cell neighbour of mine took it upon himself to broadcast to the rest of the prison that I was in this particular cell, in this particular wing and landing. And he did so with his other next door neighbour on the other side of me, setting up a sort of Afro-Caribbean chant. And as we're in a church, I think I better spare you the fruity details of this chant. But the gist of it was that expletive deletive, Aitken has now arrived in cell 321B on House Block 4. Tomorrow morning, lads, let's show him. Bye. And then a whole lot of very dramatic suggestions, what they could do to various parts of my anatomy to show me what they thought of Tory cabinet ministers. This was unsettling, to put it mildly. But anyway, gradually I calmed down, gradually I got through it, and I got a pretty good night's sleep, amazingly. When I woke up the next morning, I woke up to a familiar cry as it became, with the officers going down the wing and shouting, "Unlock, everybody out." They unlock ourselves, and we have to stand on the wing, and they have a roll call. I suddenly remembered as I stood there that the noisiest vocalist in the rather unpleasant chant the night before had been my next door neighbours. So I became a little bit edgy, only to find these guys who'd been so hostile the night before were extremely pleasant the following morning. "Morning," they said. "How are you? Sorry about last night," one of them said. "Nothing personal," said the other. You know, everyone was on the tackle, on the drugs. You know, no one meant it personally. One of us now coming over rosy, a cup of tea. And gradually I started to get into the comradeship, the fraternity of my wing. And as my eyes became accustomed to the landscape of prison, I saw one or two things which amazed me and would probably surprise you. The first thing was how young everybody was. The average age of a prisoner in the big London prisons is about 23, which means that a lot of 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds are in the system in prison. And I felt like sort of Methuselah at 55 alongside them. That was the next thing was the astonishing use of drugs. My first weekend in Belmarsh prison, I thought I was in some sort of Moroccan souk rather than English jail. People were spinning around on these substances, clucking it, and so on as they call it, and extraordinary how much was going on. But the third thing I noticed quite quickly, as I started just to get into contact with my fellow prisoners, was for all the bad things probably everyone, including me, had done, a lot of these guys were themselves rather vulnerable. And I stumbled across this as a result of a not unamusing little incident. I was minding my own business, doing nothing in association, which is a sort of prisoner's tea break, one morning, and a young guy came up to me and drew me aside and in a conspiratorial whisper said, "Hey, I've got a problem. Could you help me? My problem is I've just had a letter from my brief and I can't read it. Could you read it for me?" "Sure." And I read it to him, and it was a letter telling him via his solicitor that the Lambeth Council were going to evict him and his wife and small son from their flat, their council flat, for non-payment of rent. And when he got this news, this guy climbed up the wall, shouting, screaming, kicking off, as it's called in prison. And the only sort of coherent refrain was, "What shall I do? My wife's going to be on the street, my kid's going to be on the street. What shall I do?" Well, as it happens, considering we were both prisoners in Belmarsh prison, he could not have found a more expert source of advice to ask this question too. Why? Because for the last 24 years as a backbench MP, I'd been doing eviction cases. And so I knew every wrinkle in the system, how to postpone an eviction, all the kind of things you can do. And I told him some of these things, and I said, if you just put them in a letter back to your solicitor of the council, they'll have to react in a helpful way and give you more time. And then his face fell, and he said, hey, I got another problem. I don't know no reading nor no writing neither. Could you write the letter for me? I said, sure. So I wrote him a 2-page letter with all these things, like somebody's going to pay off some installments, my son's got mental health problems, all the postponement devices. And he was kind enough to say, oh, it's very good. He said, well done. And then he did something extraordinary. Instead of the obvious thing to do, which was to put it in the postbox or to put it in his pocket, instead he transformed himself into a sort of 18th century town crier. And holding the letter aloft, he went down the wing, saying over and over again at the top of his voice, hey guys, this MP geezer of ours, he's got fantastic joined-up writing. Now, this commercial for my graphological skills fell on the ears of a surprisingly receptive audience because, and here's another prison surprise, about a third of all prisoners, certainly in a big city jail, can't read or write properly, if at all. How do we know that? Because every incoming prisoner has to do a test. I don't forget mine in a hurry. The first question was, the fat cat sat on the M blank T, fill in the blank. And the questions got a bit harder, but not much. Anyway, I passed. But a third of my fellow prisoners did not. Illiteracy is a big, big problem in jails and the worlds of crime. Thanks to the town crier, my status as a prisoner was transformed because from that moment onwards, every single night of my sentence, a queue used to form outside my cell of, on the whole, young men wanting letters read to them or written for them by a prisoner who would help them. And it was very, very interesting work, needless to say. I learned a lot about my fellow prisoners, really got to know them, got to know what made them tick, why they'd done it. I had a lot of fascinating conversations. And so instead of being that effing Tory minister, I was always not a bad geezer, helped me with my letter. And this activity, which was very busy, I mean, I must have written 10, 15, 20 letters every day, often on the most intimate subjects imaginable. And it became a butt of a certain amount of good-natured prison humour. I remember one old lag said to me, hey, Jono, do you realise this letter-writing business of yours, with it you are making a fantastic impact on the girls of Brixton. They can't believe the sudden improvement in the love letters they're getting rid of. Well, be that as it may, I was making a friend or two. And one of the more interesting friends I made was a young Irish burglar called Paddy. And Paddy seemed to have a rather complicated love life, but I wrote many letters for him, and we get on fine, and we're talking. And after I'd done quite a bit of this, he was a man of enormous sort of Irish burglar charm, and very nice to me indeed. And one evening, I've been there about 3 months by this time, he suddenly sort of came in to chat, and then he became rather formal and said, Jono, on behalf of the lads, I've been deputed to give you a present, to thank you for all these letters you've been writing for me and others. And the present I'd like to give you, and he then started rummaging around in a tatty old box. He said, here's my library, and you can have anything you like to choose from it. And then he spread in front of me an amazing selection of hardcore porn magazines. After a fleeting moment of temptation, I said, thanks, but no thanks, Paddy. And Paddy rather was offended by this. Why did you say no thank you? I didn't want to ask another question, but I said, well, if you want to know, Paddy, it's because I'm trying a different path in life. Oh, what kind of path would that be? And I said, well, if you want to know, Paddy, it's a sort of path of trying to find out about faith. I mean, I've been waiting a long time to be sentenced. I've been going to church for the first time in many years. I've done an Alpha course, and it's sort of kind of, I'm on a different path. And then all of a sudden silence fell in that cell. And it was broken by Paddy saying, you know, I'd really like to try that path myself. My nan, she used to believe in all that Jesus stuff. And she sort of had something different. And I can sort of see maybe you've got something a bit different. So this faith stuff, how do you get on the path? I'd like to get on the path. I cannot tell you how much I did not want to answer that question. I was no sort of preacher man. I was at a very low point of my own life, kind of morally, spiritually, everything else. And the idea that I could help somebody, but on the other hand, Paddy was sort of, with his Irish charm, pressing me. So I said, well, I think the way you get on it, Paddy, you pray, that's what you do. Well, how do we pray then? So moving out of my comfort zone very fast, because I had not belonged to some evangelical church like yours. I'd always belonged to the church reticent wing of Anglicanism if I'd belonged to anything at all. And we didn't do praying out loud there, let alone praying with somebody else. Very alien territory. But nevertheless, you're in prison, you've got an Irish guy saying, how do we pray? So I started to sort of try and articulate to pray with Paddy. And we prayed together first night, second night, third night, fourth night, just the two of us. And then Paddy said, you know, this stuff's too good just to keep to the two of us. And I nodded, thinking that maybe he was going to bring in another Irish burglar to make our twosome a threesome. Not a bit of it. Paddy had the qualities of a fine recruiting sergeant. And he shot off around the jail saying, anyone want to come and pray tonight with me and Johnny? And that night, about 6 or 8 people turned up. I can remember their names, or anything to you, but I certainly remember their occupations. There was a blagger who was an armed robber. There was somebody called the Big Dipper of Tower Hamlets, who was an expert pickpocket. There was a blower who cracked safes for a living. There was a kiter who is such an energetic fraudster that he doesn't just pass a few dud checks, passes so many they fly around like kites. Another couple of lifers who were murderers, a couple more Irish burglars, and suddenly we had a rather interesting sort of group together. It gave a new meaning to the term a cell group. Anyway, mysteriously and bafflingly, this group got going. I was not its leader. I was its greatest learner. But you have all that time in prison, nothing to do, and you start to read. I had got hold of a few leaflets from the Alpha course, and we started to read the Bible. And before we knew it, the cell group had doubled in size, and then doubled again. So about 18 people cramming into the cell. We then ran into trouble with the volumetric control rules of Her Majesty's Prison Service. We were 2 minutes prisoners taking up too small a space, so we were moved on. But anyway, it kept going and grew in momentum. And I haven't got time to tell you tonight all the interesting things that happened in that prayer group. But they were interesting. And because people, when they're on the floor, reaching out in times of trouble, extraordinary stuff pours out. And I always wonder one thing which has just stuck with me. Later on in life, I started to get more deeply interested in all this, and I heard about the doctrine of the Trinity, which when I heard it explained was pretty difficult to understand academically, 3 persons in God and so on. And I'm not sure I ever understood it academically, but I absolutely understood it in that prison prayer group, because I used to hear my fellow prisoners, some of them opening up their prayers in very expected ways. Our Father, That means something much deeper, with a whole lot of people who've no idea who their fathers was very often. They've never had a dad saying, I love you, well done, son. And they've been in care. And so the resonance of the phrase, our Father, when you start to explain. And then there were people who used to pray, O Lord Jesus. And again, when you start to talk about it, they did that because they really wanted the things that Jesus stands for: forgiveness, healing, love of sinners, mercy. And then there were those who wanted to pray to God the Holy Spirit because, and I think I was in this category, they wanted the power of the Holy Spirit to come and help them to change their characters, change their lives, clean up their bad faults. And just a small illustration of how that prison prayer group started to certainly get to me and get me increasingly interested in this whole way of life in a prison cell with a whole lot of other prisoners. It was a bit the blind leading the blind. The chaplain at the beginning had nothing to do with it at all, didn't know about it. But one evening he rather shyly asked if he could come. And we said, of course you can come. There was a vote in the prayer group. And he only was allowed to come by small majority on the grounds that, we don't want the pie hearing what we were saying. Who wanted the pie? I'm always called the pie in prison now, Father Pie. Pie and liquor equals vicar. And so that's why they were. But actually, when he came, the chaplain was utterly charming. He peeled off his dog collar and said, look, I just want to be an ordinary member of the group because I'm a sinner too. He won a few friends that night. But the spiritual journey was pretty deep and certainly got me increasingly interested. So interested that when I came out of prison, I made another interesting career move. I went to the one institution in Britain that had worse food and more uncomfortable beds than a prison. This was an Anglican theological college called Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. And I went there and I had 3 wonderful years there under brilliant tutors and got a degree and so on, and did all the things that all the other college students were doing, going on missions and so on. But they were all, I think, 120 Wycliffe students at Oxford, and 118 of them were all going on to be priests. I decided, despite people saying, I'm sure you're going to join our club sooner or later, I said, actually, no, I think I'm totally unsuitable to be a priest. I'm too old, I couldn't do it, I wouldn't be any good at vicaring. And so when I left Wycliffe, I went on being, I hope, a reasonably good Christian, going to church. I was also always very interested in prison ministry, but and went into prisons to do prison ministry with prisoners, but I absolutely was determined not to be a vicar. You'll have noticed that didn't work out. I'm wearing a dog collar. How on earth did that happen? I mean, I did think vaguely of maybe I was being a monk, and vaguely explored that. Then there was the celibacy problem, and just at this moment I met my present wife, and it was 19 years ago. I was talking with a friend tonight who knows her well, and Elizabeth, and she was previously married to 2 movie stars. She was Mrs. Rex Harrison, and then she was Mrs. Richard Harris. I say that Michael Jason knows her well. I'm by far her most boring husband. But anyway, this stopped me anyway thinking of going off and being a celibate monk. And so I kept going in sort of lay ministry and was pretty determined that the ordained ministry wasn't for me. So why am I wearing a dog collar now? The answer is a bit of a mystery, I'm not sure I understand it. But what really happened, I'm sure those of you who pray and there's a good Christian audience, you occasionally do what I do, which is just ask God, is there anything else that he'd like you to do? And I did ask him that from time to time, and suddenly I got sort of mysterious murmuring saying, "I'd like you to be ordained." I said more politely than I'm saying now, "Shut up, God, this is a silly request. I mean, I'm absolutely too old and too unsuitable for all kinds of reasons." But this niggling went on. And then about 4 years ago, no, 5 years ago, in the middle of the August summer heat, there was, as happens from time to time, trouble in the prisons. And there were riots, there were fights, there were nasty things happening. And as happens sometimes in the middle of August, the media made much too much of it, and there were people who got up and said, "We've got to send the army into the prisons." And I wrote an article for the Sunday Times, which being August, they take on the sort of second 11 of writers. And I had a full page for myself saying, "Calm down, this is not the moment to be sending in the army. Things are changing. Prison service is suddenly getting modernized, and there's a lot of good people coming in, but it's tricky, but, you know, just don't overreact." And read the article, got a certain amount of media attention. And suddenly somebody, I should say, at this point of my dialogue with a mysterious voice saying, "I want you to get ordained," I said, "Give me a sign then," which is one thing you should never say to God, but give me a sign if you really want this to happen. And suddenly after this article was appeared and was published, the next thing I knew, somebody said to me, "Have you seen Archbishop Justin's tweet about you?" I had no idea, this is some years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury did tweets. Also, I didn't know how to tweet or connect. It took me about 2 days to connect up. But the Archbishop said something extremely complimentary about the article. And then there was a sentence which said something, "And Jonathan Aitken has become a good and godly man." I thought, crikey. He's saying that maybe I should at least explore the idea of getting ordained, but not to be a vicar, but to be a prison chaplain, because I sort of thought that's something I might be able to do. And so after a journey of discernment, as they call it in the Church of England, and I was accepted because I already got a theology degree. It was fairly easy. And I was ordained 4 years ago as a prison chaplain. And that's what I now do. I should tell you one other thing about my journey to ordination. When I was still saying, perhaps less firmly, "Please be quiet, God, this is not a good idea," I stumbled across a little verse of doggerel. And it was written by a man who had been cricket captain of England. He was as famous in his day as Joe Root, but it was a different age. He'd been cricket captain of Cambridge and captain of England in the Ashes team. His name was C.T. Studd. And while he was at Cambridge, he sort of got religion and said, "I want to be ordained." And everyone said, "Oh, you know, great C.T., great batsman, of course he'd be ordained. He'd be a bishop in no time. Think of David Shepherd or whatever it was." And he said, "No, I absolutely don't want to be a bishop. I want to be a prison chaplain." And everyone said, "Why?" Because then, as now, prison chaplains are well below the salt in the hierarchy of the Church of England. But here was the great C.T. Studd, a household name, saying, "I want to be a prison chaplain." And he got so fed up with people asking him why, and "Why don't you think?" He wrote a little verse of doggerel, which goes as follows. "Some like to live within the sound of church and chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell." And as soon as I read that, I said, "Gosh, I'd love to do that." And that's what I do. I am now a prison chaplain in Pentonville, and absolutely love it. Never a dull moment. It ranges from agony, arrive in the morning, never know what's going to be told to happen in the night. Someone's tried to commit suicide, you've got to go and see him. Someone's done really bad self-harming, blood pouring out on the cell door, you're going to see him. A lot of people are very sort of broken because they've suddenly lost all contact with their families and are miserable, and a chaplain can be quite a useful bit of communication. but often they just want to sit quietly and have a little bit of prayer and a talk. And I have this huge advantage, which is that I used to be a prisoner. And when I tell them this, they first of all say, "Oh, go on with it." You know, I'm going to posh boy like we posh in prison. And we have but a few words about various nicks we've all been. I soon convinced them that I'm the real thing, and that's a great advantage in just being able to tune into the wavelength. And all those letters written some time ago are a big, big help. I found my vocation, and I suppose this story is a little bit about redemption, although not just my redemption. I must tell you something about Paddy and his redemption, which was much more spectacular in its way. Paddy, in this prayer group, took it enormously seriously. He was sort of on sec of the prayer group, and he organized it and ran it. And then he became the most passionate, most committed Christian you can imagine. Slightly sort of OTT, but he was wonderful in his burning faith. And one day he came into the prayer group and said, "You know, I've been thinking, and I realize what a mess up I've made of my life, and I want to do something about it. And I'm able to start here in the prison because since I've been here, my partner has given birth to a new baby, and I've decided that I'm going to have her baptized here in the prison chapel." And this is sort of possible, so the chaplain said yes, and so we had the baptism service of Paddy's infant baby in the chapel. I'll never forget it for as long as I live, for a number of reasons, some of them comic, some of them spiritual. The first thing that happened, which was unusual, is that when the mother of the baby showed up, the baby was clad in a remarkable christening dress. If I tried to describe what was remarkable about it, I would say, well, the lorry it must have fallen off the back of would almost certainly have been on its way to the outsized woman shop, because it was the most ginormous adult lady's wedding dress you can imagine, yards and yards of flowing. So when the baby, the star of the show, was lowered into this gargantuan wedding dress, she looked like a tiny little boat entering huge billowing white sails, waves. And the inevitable happened, the boat capsized, not once, but several times. And the good chaplain got going, and he hadn't got past the first prayer, when whoops, the baby had vanished completely off into one of the sleeves of the dress. And she was pulled back, sent it down for about another 30 seconds, and then whoops, she vanished in the trunk of the dress. Everybody, it became an audience participation service in no time, because people rushed up, pulled the little baby out of the trunk of the dress, and in the sweetest possible way, prayed over, calmed her down, mopped her little brow. And this extraordinary scene, when I was pinching myself, I started to say, because the friends who Paddy brought along were, on the whole, his prayer group members. And I started to remember that these guys who are now behaving so angelically with their prayers, their solicitude of the baby, these are guys, I got to know them quite well, who a few months ago, their hands doing beautiful things today, had hands which have had fingers on triggers, fists in brawls, outstretched palms to receive drug deals, and so on. And I sort of said to myself, goodness, this is extraordinary. Why is it happening? And the answer, of course, is that when people go on a journey of prayer, they meet the real hero of the story, who is, of course, Jesus Christ. What does Jesus do when people turn to him, however bad they've been, in faith and in prayer? He rushes out to meet them, as he did in the story of the prodigal son. And they meet him and they change. And I suddenly said, my goodness, these guys, a lot of them have changed. And of course, I was in the process of changing myself, which is why I later went off to Wycliffe. I shouldn't say about myself that I have been redeemed. I've been rehabilitated. That's man's business. We can all get rehabilitated. Redemption is God's business, and we won't really know whether we've been redeemed or not this side of the grave. But I do feel, and I hope you feel, that you have heard us talk tonight from somebody who's very happy, someone who's very fulfilled, someone who is certainly different to the politician and other things that I used to be. And I dare say there is somebody here in a big audience like this who's hearing all this and saying, you know, I wouldn't mind a bit of that. I wouldn't mind being able to get on a journey of change. How do you do it? Well, it's really, Paddy has signposted the way. Remember what Paddy said to me, you know, I'd really like to try that path myself. I guess there's somebody here tonight, just one person, who might be saying something rather similar. If you are, I'm sure that Ben, your pastor, or people in your church would just love to help you. So my final word is, I hope there's someone here tonight who would like to try that path, and if they would, I'm sure that your church or your pastor or anyone known to you who's got some Christian faith would love to help you. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll now take questions. Thank you.